Get ready, put on your parkas, winter boots, and snowshoes. We are going north. Way north. As in months of darkness and reindeer and stories of Santa Claus north. Okay, well, maybe not quite that far north, but we're going to start talking about the Nordic countries, whose place during the Cold War is quite often forgotten, despite being, in some cases, literally right on the front lines of the conflict. Today, we're going to look at Finland, a former part of the Russian Empire, but also a relatively new nation, which had defeated the Soviet Union during the Winter War, but was under constant threat of being swallowed back into Moscow's fold. I'm your host David, and this week, you get to hear me butcher names in a language renowned for having a lot of vowels. This is the Cold War. Like several 100,000 fellow Karelians, we became refugees in our own country as great power politics caused the borders of Finland to be redrawn and left my hometown as part of the Soviet Union. These are the words of Martti Ahtisaari, the Finnish politician, diplomat, and Nobel laureate. The Moscow Armistice, signed between the Soviet Union and Finland in September of 1944, created the situation Ahtisaari is talking about. Although Finland is often recognized as winning the earlier Winter War in 1939 and 1940, it suffered harsh losses during the Continuation War as Finland fought the Soviets on the side of the Germans. The Moscow Armistice restored the terms of the earlier Moscow Peace Treaty, but did have some modification. It forced Finland into significant land concessions to the Soviet Union, including ceding territories such as Petsamo, Karelia, and Salla. The Finns were also forced to lease Porkkala to the USSR for a 50-year term and were forced to pay a staggering $300 million reparations bill. That's the equivalent today of $4.3 billion. In addition to these land and financial reparations, the Communist Party in Finland was officially legalized, and several prominent Finnish politicians, whom the Soviets considered to be fascists, were arrested, including but not limited to a president, 2 prime ministers, and more than several ministers. In March 1945, parliamentary elections were held in Finland, and the SDKL, a broad coalition of leftist organizations, came into power, led by Juho Kusti Paasikivi as prime minister, until he became president in 1946, after the resignation of the war hero Baron Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim. That name's really just fun to say. The Soviet Union, for its part, gave Finland a rather unique position in its foreign policy. Stalin certainly did not want to see the Finns become part of the Western coalition. However, it was also content to not have Finland be one of its satellite states, like those being formed in Eastern Europe. Instead, Moscow was happy for Finland to be a neutral state, which could act as a buffer between itself and the capitalist West. Of course, this didn't mean that Finland was free to do entirely what it wanted, and in order to protect Soviet interests, Moscow proposed the signing of the Finno-Soviet Treaty of 1948. This treaty would obligate Finland to resist attacks by, quote, Germany or its allies, and also enabled Finland to ask for Soviet military assistance in the event of an attack. Importantly, however, it did not obligate Finland to aid the Soviet Union in the event that it was attacked. The treaty effectively made Finland a neutral country, as it also greatly reduced the chances that it would join any future Western-based military alliances. Looking at you, NATO. This treaty also left Finnish democratic and capitalistic structures in place. Now, you might be asking yourself why Finland received this preferential treatment when other countries in the Soviet sphere certainly did not. The answer to this has to do with geography. Not only was the Finnish-Soviet border right next to the Soviet Union's second city of Leningrad, but in the far north, the Finnish border stretched next to the significant Soviet military region of the Kola Peninsula, a vital strategic area for the Soviet Union. A neutral Finland greatly reduced the threat of attack by the West through this region. But anyway, back to the Finno-Soviet Treaty. At the time it was being signed, there was a great deal of concern among the Finnish people. Many were watching the process of Sovietization unfold in places such as Poland, Romania, and Hungary, and they feared their own real independence would be ended. At this time, both the Finnish Prime Minister and the Minister of Justice were openly pro-Soviet, and the Ministers of Social Affairs and of Justice were leading communists. They also commanded the loyalty of the head of the state police, also a communist. As you will recall, these were all key roles in other East Bloc nations in undermining democratic systems to replace them with communist governments. However, the Finnish constitution gave the president and the parliament the ability to block policies and even dismiss ministers. These powers were utilized, and soon the communists in the cabinet had been ousted and the state police were even disbanded. And what made these changes possible? Well, the loyalty of both the regular police and the army to the non-communist forces in the government, of course. In fact, both the police and the army were deployed to Helsinki at one point in order to prevent a potential coup. Oh yeah, and of course the tacit approval of the Soviet Union. Because Stalin was confident of the long-term neutrality of Finland, he didn't feel the need to intervene. Stalin's instincts proved correct. The Finnish leadership, wary of the possibility of Soviet interference, did its best to avoid the potential wrath of Moscow. The Finnish policy that emerged has become known as the Paasikivi-Kekkonen Doctrine, after Juho Kusti Paasikivi, president from 46 to 56, and Urho Kekkonen, president from 1956 to 1981. The doctrine, which was derisively known as Finlandization in the West, safeguarded Finnish independence and democracy in exchange for their neutrality in the Cold War. While Finland was able to maintain normal economic trade relations with countries in the West, it was forced to reject Marshall Plan aid and was unable to join NATO or any other overt alliance systems, and even censored the anti-Soviet and anti-communist media. Although Finland was cautious about its foreign policy, only establishing a diplomatic relationship with Washington in 1954, Finland found itself as espionage ground zero for some of the Cold War's top intelligence services. Both the KGB and the Stasi were active in Finland, while the Finnish Social Democratic Party, at the time a leading anti-communist political party, received funding from the CIA in exchange for seismic data on Soviet nuclear tests. The initial offer for Finland to join the Nordic Council, formed in 1952, was rejected under pressure from Moscow, but following Stalin's death the next year, Soviet policy towards Finland began to relax. Somewhat. In 1955, the Porkala Peninsula, under Soviet lease until 1994, was returned to Finland. Soviet troops stationed in Finland were withdrawn, and more leeway on the foreign stage was granted. By 1955, Finland joined the United Nations and also the Nordic Council, allowing free movement between the 5 Nordic nations, and political, economic, and even cultural ties began to be formed across the region. So remember that quote I gave by Martti Ahtisaari a few minutes ago? It referred to hundreds of thousands of displaced people. So what was that about? Well, he was referring to the approximate 400,000 Finnish refugees that were being removed from territory seized by the Soviet Union. This, coupled with the infrastructure damage and population loss caused by the Winter War and the Continuation War, made the economic situation in Finland extremely tough. The Finnish solution to this, however, was land redistribution for those refugees. Up to 142,000 new farm holdings were created, speeding their integration into the Finnish economy. One of the biggest economic issues that Finland needed to deal with, however, was the reparation bill that I had mentioned earlier. That was the $300 million one. The reparation payments made from 1944 through to 1952 equaled to an annual average of more than 2% of Finnish GDP. But the strict schedule was adhered to, as the penalties for late shipments were harsh. As the Soviets realized, however, how earnest the Finns were in maintaining their schedule, they did extend the payment schedule an extra 2 years to 1956. Of course, it was not all good guy action, as Finland was prevented in accepting Marshall Plan aid, which would in all likelihood really helped out the Finnish economy. Now, despite the Soviets trying to keep Finnish foreign relations somewhat in check, they did allow the United States to mediate an extension of financial credits to Finland through the Export-Import Bank, worth more than $100 million, allowing for both economic rebuilding. And why would the Soviet Union allow any US involvement? Well, because those reparation payments were needed by the Soviet economy itself busy rebuilding. You can make what you want of that. So there you have it. A nation in the post-war period that was occupied by the Soviet Union, forced to pay reparations in cash and land, but was able to retain its democratic and capitalist systems. It created a neutral ground, one where the superpowers could meet and even try to resolve issues. But that's material for future episodes. We hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and to make sure you don't miss future episodes, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button. The Cold War channel now has merchandise available through Teespring, so check out what's on offer over at teespring.com/stores/thecoldwar. We can also be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. Please consider supporting us via Patreon at www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is The Cold War channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.